In the spring of 1854, British and French forces arrived on the Crimean Peninsula to support the Ottoman Empire against Russian expansion. The campaign was expected to be brief. Military planners in London anticipated a swift victory, perhaps wrapped up before winter. The troops shipped adequate supplies for a summer campaign. No one seriously considered what would happen if the war continued into colder months. The initial landings went smoothly. Allied forces captured key positions and settled in for what they assumed would be a short siege of Sevastopol. But as autumn approached, the Russian fortress showed no signs of falling. British commanders had committed to a strategy that required holding their position through the coming winter. Records from the War Office show that senior officials began requesting additional supplies in late September, but the requests moved slowly through bureaucratic channels. The British supply system relied on a single port at Balaclava, a small harbor never designed to handle the volume of materials needed to sustain tens of thousands of soldiers. Ships arrived carrying food, ammunition, and winter clothing, but no organized system existed to move these supplies the 7 miles to the front lines. The army had sent insufficient numbers of transport animals. Wagons broke down on the rough coastal roads. Supplies accumulated at the docks while soldiers on the heights above began facing the first cold rains of October. Military historian accounts suggest that British officials believed the local infrastructure would prove adequate. They had not surveyed the terrain carefully. The roads between Balaclava and the siege lines were little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud under autumn storms. Meanwhile, the Army's Commissariat Department operated under regulations written for peacetime operations in garrison towns, not active campaigns in remote territories. Officers requisitioned supplies through formal paperwork that often took weeks to process. By November, conditions in the British camps had deteriorated significantly. Soldiers lacked proper shelter. Many were still wearing the light uniforms issued for summer campaigning. Hospital tents filled with men suffering from exposure, dysentery, and cholera. The army had sent medical supplies, but these too sat in warehouses at Balaclava, undelivered. Transport remained the fundamental problem. Horses and mules died from overwork and inadequate fodder. Without them, even available supplies could not reach the troops. The situation became widely known in Britain through newspaper reports sent by correspondents on the ground. William Howard Russell of the Times described soldiers dying not from enemy action, but from cold, hunger, and disease. His dispatches reached London in late November and sparked public outcry. The government faced intense pressure to respond, but the distance and complexity of the supply chain meant that meaningful improvements would take months to implement. Evidence from military records indicates that roughly 20,000 British soldiers died during the Crimean campaign. Historians estimate that fewer than 2,000 of these deaths occurred in actual combat. The remainder succumbed to disease and exposure, conditions directly linked to inadequate supply and poor logistical planning. French forces, operating from the same theater, suffered similarly high rates of disease, though their supply system proved somewhat more adaptable. The War Office did eventually respond. By early 1855, they had contracted a railway to be built from Balaclava to the siege lines. Additional medical staff arrived, including a nursing corps organized by Florence Nightingale. New procedures were established for hospital care. Supply requisitions were streamlined, but these reforms came after the worst of the winter had already passed. The measures that could have prevented the crisis were implemented only after thousands had already died. What made this failure particularly striking was that it was not inevitable. The British Army possessed the resources and industrial capacity to supply its forces adequately. Ships carrying winter clothing and medical equipment arrived at Balaclava in November and December. The materials existed. What failed was the system for distributing them. No single person made a catastrophic error. Rather, a series of small assumptions and procedural inadequacies combined to create conditions that proved fatal. Military planners had assumed the campaign would be short. Quartermasters had assumed local roads would suffice. Commissariat officials had assumed peacetime procedures would adapt to wartime needs. Each assumption seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they created a logistical breakdown that turned a manageable military operation into a humanitarian disaster. The financial cost extended beyond the immediate campaign. The British government spent approximately £70 million on the Crimean War, a sum that strained the national budget. Much of this expenditure went toward correcting the logistical failures after they had already occurred. Emergency shipments of supplies, construction of the railway, expansion of hospital facilities, all represented reactive spending that could have been avoided with more careful initial planning. The experience prompted significant reforms in British military administration. A royal commission investigated the conduct of the war and issued recommendations for restructuring the Army's supply departments. The War Office created new procedures for logistical planning. Medical services were reorganized. These changes influenced British military operations for decades afterward, but they came at the cost of thousands of lives and enormous public expenditure. Records from the period show that officials recognized many of these problems even as they were unfolding. Correspondence between commanders in the Crimea and administrators in London reveals awareness that the supply system was failing. Yet institutional inertia, bureaucratic procedures, and the sheer distance involved meant that knowledge of the problem did not translate quickly into effective solutions. The gap between recognition and response proved deadly. The Crimean supply failure demonstrates how organizational systems can break down not through malice or incompetence in any simple sense, but through accumulated small failures of foresight, coordination, and adaptation. Each individual decision might have seemed defensible at the time. The error lay in the system as a whole, in assumptions left unexamined and contingencies left unplanned. The campaign began with confidence in established procedures, but those procedures had never been tested under these specific conditions. What appeared in 1854 to be a straightforward military operation became one of the most costly administrative failures in British military history. The consequences became fully apparent only as winter deepened and soldiers continued to die from preventable causes. The mistake was not in fighting the war, but in failing to prepare adequately for the realities of sustaining an army far from home through conditions that had been deemed unlikely but were never impossible. Thousands paid for that failure with their lives.